Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game.
Woo! Board game. I got board game. I got board
And
game.
so today we are actually planning to actually record two videos for you. This first one right now is going to be a non-spoiler review. And then we'll do a spoiler review after this one. So hopefully this one won't take too long and you can jump to that one after. But the
Unless you don't
reason
want
why
to
we're
jump.
doing this, sorry, what?
Unless you don't want to jump because it's spoilers.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yes. And the reason why I wanted to do this this time is because we are actually going to review a pretty big game, definitely compared to games we've been reviewing, where we've been kind of reviewing games that are more family friendly, right? Games that are more easy to find at like retail stores. But this one is definitely a big one, had a big impact in the board game world, and one that we found very different. And finally, it is time to share about this game. And so today,
Back to the Future.
we're reviewing Back to the Future.
Because it has to do with time.
Oh, board games that tell stories. That's what we're reviewing. Yes, today we are reviewing Time Stories. Man, look at that sleek white box. So, Time Stories came out in 2015 by Space Cowboys. I believe that's the company. Yeah, Space Cowboys, I believe. And it is for 2 to 4 players. Plays in, the box says 90 minutes per session. And that's important because this is a game where you'll probably need to play a few, if not multiple sessions to finish the game itself, because it is a story-driven game. So when you're playing the game, you're choosing a scenario and then playing through that whole story. And in that way, the game is, in a sense, one-time play, as in once you finish the scenario, you'll kind of know the secrets, know what happened, so you might not want to play it again. It won't be different afterward. But I have found that it is something that you could then let someone else play, because you're not actually I don't think normally changing any components. Normally.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a legacy game, basically. It's not one where you're ripping cards, marking things up. So it is reusable. So you could even have someone else play that doesn't know the story. And so, again, this is non-spoiler, so we're not going to tell anything about the stories, but we're going to explain how the game as a system works and what we like, don't like about that. And so, again, then the more specific details on the first scenario will be in our spoiler review. So to get into a brief overview of how the game flows, let me switch to the right picture of the game set up. So this is a picture of the components of the game, most of the components, the basic components, if you will. Because as we mentioned, Time Stories, it is kind of like a system for playing these scenarios. So it has these general pieces that you're always going to use and set up, but then you'll also take the parts, the cards, mainly from a scenario, and then use that to play the story out on this board. And so the overall theme of Time Stories and the whole series is that it's a cooperative game where you are all agents of the T.I.M.E agency, the Time Agency, which their purpose is to travel through time, making sure that any kind of big dangers to the timeline are prevented.
Anomalies or issues that they identify in the past.
Yeah, and so then there is this kind of ongoing, overarching story through all the scenarios too of you being in this agency, and that's why you're going back to these different scenarios, times to handle certain things. And so as agents then, when you set up the game, you're going to put this board in the middle. You'll have these tokens Like over here, these different colored tokens are basically generic tokens for this system, where the scenario you choose will tell you how they're used. For example, some of these tokens, like the green ones in one scenario, might be some kind of health item, where then in another scenario, these yellow tokens could be bullets or something for a character. Where in another scenario, actually just a warning, there are more mature scenarios that you want to be aware of. So this game does say 12 plus, but it also depends on the scenario, how old people you want to play with. But like in some scenario, these tokens could indicate drugs that a character has. That's why I had to give my warning. So, and then down here, these tokens too are also generic indicators of maybe certain clues or information your characters have found. And so after you have this set aside, you'll choose your own character marker down here. It's basically another generic marker, but you're going to be using to indicate your character and where your character is moving. And then depending on the scenario, there will be a deck of cards from which will have certain setup instructions, but also characters that you can choose to be. And so in this game, the characters in a given scenario are called receptacles, because they're basically the people, the bodies you're inhabiting when you get launched back in time into that time period. So then you're investigating, doing actions as that person then. And so we'll show those in the other video of what those characters would be like in one of the scenarios. But for now, just know that you'll take on a character receptacle to go back in time. And then when you set up the game initially, you're always going to start in the time agency, your own HQ. And you'll basically take those cards given in that deck and set them up in these slots, A, B, C, D, and so on, however many cards there are for that location. Because each location is formed by a certain number of these cards that are put in order. And once they are laid out here, they form a panorama. So for example, one of the first places you'll be teleported to in the first scenario is this asylum.
Spoilers, but blocked off.
Yeah, so some of it's blurred, so it's not spoiling anything for you guys, but you can see how the setup kind of looks. Where one of the big mechanics in the game is the deck of cards, which is basically has different groupings of cards that form a location, which then gets set out here to form that location visually. You'll see it like this, right? B card will have something, C, D, and then on the other side of, for example, the B card here is the text of what's actually happening in that part of the room. And so when you start, you'll start in the time agency, but then once you actually get into the scenario and get teleported back to whatever time period, you'll take out the next set of location cards and set them out, like we're showing here, this first room of the asylum that you get teleported to in the first scenario. And so then that's when the game really begins, where then using your character marker, your player marker, you guys will choose cooperatively where you want to go in that location, because each card, B, C, D, and so on, is a different section of that location. In this case, a different section of the day room. And why that matters is because when you put your character piece on that location, that means you're going to check out what's happening there. And then maybe John will put his piece on D here to see what's happening in this section of the room with this painting and this creepy girl.
Now I'm going to B too.
And so then once you've decided that cooperatively, the players in those locations are the only ones who get to read what's on the other side of that card. And you don't read it out loud. You're the only one who gets to see it and read it to yourself. And so then you'll know what's happening in that section of the location. And then once you've read it and put the card back face down, showing the artwork side, then you can communicate with your whole team of what you saw or what you heard or read. But the whole idea is that you're going to check it out and then report back, but you don't get to just read what's on the card to each other. At least that's how this game is supposed to be played. It's that kind of slight memory and then communicating what's happening and then keeping track of the different clues you're coming across. And so then every time you choose to move to a different location or a different section of a location, or even handle some event at a location, like if you read that there's some kind of puzzle you have to solve there, or some even combat, someone's attacking you or something, and you need to defend yourself or fight back. Each time you do that, it takes up time units, which is this track in the middle up here. And so each scenario will give you a certain amount of time for your run, for your session. And so you just have to keep that in mind of, if you use one time unit, one player could move to a different section, while one player already in a certain section could do an action in that section. So that's kind of how you have to plan out the actions you want to do, because you have limited time. And so this will go on. You'll keep moving, switching to another location that you might have come across. You'll pull that out of the deck and lay it out instead of the one that's already been laid out. Or you'll move to different sections, read different things, come across different clues, discover items that you'll pull out of another deck. This will continue until you either figure out the whole story and the mystery, or you run out of time. And so when you run out of time, all of you are then transported back to the time agency, the present day, if you will. And basically you'll kind of get a briefing afterwards saying, oh, how come you didn't finish, or something that went wrong. And you might have to draw a card from up here, which is also cards provided in a given scenario of success or fail cards and kind of the consequences. And then if you failed or didn't finish the whole story yet, you'll have to make another run and transport back to the beginning of the scenario, but with the knowledge obviously you already have as players. And so then you'll transport back to the beginning of the location, the first location, reset your time, and then have another run. And so this whole part will repeat for however many runs it takes you to finish the story, or ultimately just fail. And yeah, that is the flow of the game. There are other rules for how combat or solving mysteries or finding clues works that involve the dice here and these shield tokens, which are also generic tokens that kind of indicate the difficulty or life point of whatever task you're doing. And so it'll come down to a certain kind of die roll, needing a certain number of successes to whittle down the life or difficulty of the task until you finish it and get whatever clue it provides you with. But aside from that, that is the overall flow of the game. And so with that, we will come back top. And now, before we get into the pros and cons, non-spoiler pros and cons, I did mention that this game is played over scenarios. And so this game itself, this is the base game, big box, really sleek box, that comes with the system, the game board itself, all those tokens you saw, and also the first scenario called Asylum, which happens in a insane
you
asylum,
guessed it,
mental health asylum.
And
so I don't know if I should have said mental health and insane as interchangeable words there. We'll say insane asylum. But yeah, so that's the first scenario that comes in there, which we will review in our spoiler video next. But then there is a total of 9 stories in this, what's called the White Cycle of Time Stories, which I believe is the name they gave it later on, like much later on, when they came out with a sequel Time Stories called the Blue Cycle, starting the story differently. But so after Asylum, there is the Marcy case, which is a kind of what's that setting? It's kind of like
what, 19?
So I do own it, but
70s?
I was telling John before this video that I think I lent it to someone else. So I can't look it up right now. But yeah, it was like around maybe 1970s, some kind of pandemic happening.
Yeah. Ironically enough, huh?
And then after that, there was Prophecy of Dragons, which was actually to a kind of medieval fantasy time setting with
Mm-hmm.
weird magic stuff happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then the ones I do have after that is Under the Mask, which is
Egyptian themed.
happening in 1146. They always use like the year NT, which I forgot what that meant here, but I think it's supposed to be parallel to the way we count years anyway. But 1146, so some mystery in Egypt. And then Expedition Endurance, which is in 1914, and it's following kind of a trans-Antarctic expedition, and something went wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1419, Lumen Fide is in kind of the crusade setting,
Medieval. Yep.
right? And after that, you have Estrella Drive in 1982, which is kind of a mystery happening around this kind of Hollywood setting.
And as you can see on the box, mature audience only.
Yes, mature audience only. So this has some mature themes and artwork in it. And then, so those are actually all the ones John and I have played through, and even with another friend for certain scenarios.
For a couple of scenarios.
The ones we haven't played are the last two, Brotherhood of the Coast, which is pirate themed. In 1685.
Matey.
And Madame in 1673. French theme. Like, I really don't know what else to say about it. This is still wrapped up, so I don't even really know. We haven't played it. But this is the end of the whole white cycle, the whole first story, overall story of Time Stories. And so, yeah, we just wanted to make sure to show that, yeah, the game is played based on the scenario you buy to put with the Time Story system. And there is this overarching story, but then also each one is its own contained story of things that are happening, things you're solving. And each one even has different mechanics from each one, right? Because like I mentioned, there's the generic tokens that are assigned to different things. And so there's different ways each scenario uses them differently, introduces different ways to do things with the cards, locations, traveling. So yeah, that is our intro to the overall system. That is Time Stories. And so getting into the pros, finally, what we like about Time Stories overall. Go ahead, John.
About time and stories. No, but as you're saying, there was a lot to explain here. And I remember the first time we played through it, it was a little bit overwhelming in that sense because there's so much stuff that you're getting introduced to, mechanically trying to figure everything out and kind of like, what are all these components? What am I supposed to be doing with this, this, and this? How do these locations work? How do I show it? But I'll say once you kind of get past that initial thing, like that initial hump of just trying to understand what is going on, it really does flow very well and very seamlessly as an experience of going through using the mechanics. So I'd say one of the real big pros is that the mechanical aspects of these rules, these actions that you're doing, fits not only as a good way of playing and going through the story, but it actually does thematically also fit with the concept of what we've said, right? The premise of you being agents in the field, or agents for this time agency, and you're being sent back in time to do these different things, right? So even when Ben was talking about like maybe you might fail a scenario or you might run out of time during the scenarios, there's this really interesting concept of the fact that when you go back in time, right, when you think about the game, you're playing through the story, so you've been experiencing and encountering a lot of things as you progress through it. And that knowledge stays with you because when you think about the theme of what you're doing is you're playing, as we said, as external agents entering into that world through those receptacles of the characters within that time period itself. So even from a mechanics play style way, the fact that you're choosing these particular characters, it doesn't matter what character you choose because the mind of the receptacle isn't those receptacles themselves, it's your mind as the agent playing in it. So even in just the theme of the story, in how you play the game mechanically with the amount of time it takes to move from place to place, the things you encounter, the things you do, it fits into that narrative that's going on in this game.
Yeah, I think the way it does theme in that way you're describing, it is like a way that a lot of shows or movies have also done time travel, right? Like not just sending the whole person's body back in time, but you send the mind back and then you inhabit some body and you kind of take it over. So it fits with kind of a sci-fi understanding of how time travel has been done in certain shows and such. But yeah, and that's thematic about it, right? That's a cool point about how the game sets it up so that you thematically you have a reason to be these different characters in different scenarios. And yeah, and the whole setup, yeah, I remember it feeling kind of confusing going through. I mean, it's not that the rules are bad. I don't think the rules are written badly, but it is just very different from a lot of games, like especially when we start talking about comparing it to heavier games, right? Heavier ones that we reviewed, say like Viticulture. That's probably the heaviest we reviewed, right? maybe Pandemic can push towards that, but Viticulture is probably the heaviest, right?
Heavy.
Yeah. So, but even in comparing to like heavier games, it's very unique because it is not only just this system and the theme, but then even the way it's all set up, right? Where you could have like a generic system where you have generic tokens that emulate worker placement, right? And in whatever version of the game you're playing, these are your workers of some sort and you're sending them out. But it's not like that, right? It doesn't use those mechanics. The main mechanics I would say are the action selection, but it does it through this time unit mechanic, right? Which is also different. So action selection, story driven.
Yeah,
I don't know what mechanics.
So I was thinking, if we're thinking about it, it's action selection in the sense of like how you move from location to location, right? In the immediate location, as well as we didn't talk about the global location. So the tableau is kind of the immediate space that you're occupying. Like I think when we were showing the example, like a day room is a location that you're exploring, and that's your tableau. But then in the larger map, like in the top right of or top left of the board that Ben was showing, there's like a quadrant of a quadrant section, and that quadrant section effectively shows other room locations, you could say. It's not always rooms, it could be other spaces, but basically other parts of a place that you could visit, so that when you go to that location, that's what gives you the new tableau of a different set of places, of a different set of scenes to explore within
let me
that
see
space.
if I can
But
share.
The movement to those locations also costs time, right?
So yeah, this is kind of a clearer picture of what it looks like when a location is set up, right? This is the initial one in whatever scenario this is of starting at this time agency. And yeah, so as John was saying, like these are the different segments of that location that you can go to, read the other side, see what's happening.
Exactly. And then to change that one, there's another set of like of a quadrant in the top left of the board that you select that place to go to.
Yeah, like
and
your
as
map
you can kind of see it a little bit right there.
Yeah.
There's like those little dots on it. Like each of those dots would be representing a place that would be another place where there would be its own tableau of cards.
Yeah, another location that you would open up. You would put this one away and then open up the cards for that new location, forming a different panorama. And so so this game has that time unit kind of action point system, which I also think is really a cool way of doing it, because one, it's in a sense I actually found it more thematic than the typical action point system, because most board games you'll hear that have an action point system, like Pandemic, like actually most games, even if a game is saying like you have to do 2 actions on your turn out of 4 possibilities, that's still in a sense 2 action points, right? But in this case, I found it just slightly more thematic, because if it's the theme of time, but it's also the idea that you use one time unit and every player gets to choose what they're going to do during that one time. I mean, you can even count it as like 1 hour, but it's just called a time unit because it doesn't usually take an hour to do certain things you would say you're doing. But so, it takes one time unit, but then all of you get to choose something to do during that time. Versus in an general action point system game, it's not usually that thematic in the sense that, like, how come I get one action now and then you get an action and then the next player gets an action? Like, we're all flowing through time together. So shouldn't this one time unit be a time where we all do something,
Exactly.
And so it's just a nice little thematic change that makes sense to me of doing it that way. And it's, I don't think a lot of games do that either. Right? Aside from games that are just straight up simultaneous action games, right? Where you all just playing your card at the same time or something. But yeah, in this case, it's one action point and you all get to then decide in that moment what to do for your character.
Yep.
So I think that was cool. So there's that, change on the action point system. I guess another mechanic is the dice rolling, which is kind of just a lighter mechanic in the game, right? Of trying to get the number of successes that you need to overcome whatever challenge. But that was also kind of, it could be enjoyable for people who like that aspect of like RPGs, role-playing games, right? Where you have your character stat, which then determine how many dice you get to roll, right? And then there's a certain number of successes you need.
Yeah.
So kind of taking that from RPGs, I would say.
Yeah, and it's also a nice way to gamify the system a little bit more, because if it was purely based on the time unit measurement of like moving around, and then if your challenges were purely about how much time unit you use on it, then I think it becomes more of just a time unit management type of game as you go through the story. But by adding in this element of the randomness of the shields, like the shield tokens that you need to remove from the challenges in varying ways, with the dice, it adds the gaming part into it, because there are circumstances in which you can try to stack your team, like the group of agents or receptacles in a location, to try to quickly or get through a challenge very quickly, right? Which only takes one time unit if you're all there in that one spot. Or you maybe are like, we want to diversify our activities, so we're going to have other people go around. So yes, it takes one time unit for other people to go disperse, but it's a chance now for that one player to try to do it in a single time unit, right? Because they could fail instead, right? Because based on the dice, you might roll a bunch of the red skulls, which are not good, or blank. I believe they have a blank spot on the dice too. So you can roll blanks, and you just don't get enough successes to complete the challenge for that circumstance or situation. And so then it might, if you really want to do that challenge, you're going to spend another time unit to stay there to do that action, which means it's this kind of discussion between the team of like, is it really worth our time to keep trying to do this challenge, or should we just kind of give up on the challenge and move on? Right.
Yeah, and there is that kind of
decisions are very important.
Yeah, that team planning and that strategizing of like splitting up resources, right? People to do different things, because you'll also need to get further in the story, find more locations, get to the right place, while then also maybe trying to finish a certain challenge or test. Where then, I mean, not to make it sound boring, like the tests are also different, right? Yeah. They have thematic elements to it of, like I mentioned, it could be at the asylum, someone like you end up talking to someone in that section of the location who is mentally unstable, and they just like come at you, and then that starts like a fight, so you have to like defend yourself, or so there
could be a skill challenge of like, you need to jump over a hole in the ground. That's a pretty long hole, so you have to make a challenge check on that. And sometimes the rule is like, you have to succeed in one roll. Right. And if you don't succeed in one roll, you have to reset the amount of shields there and either try again, or it might even be a one-time event where you try it once, and if you fail it, then you can never do it again for the rest of that run.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to get at, that there's also that variation with the challenges that then go into your planning of like, okay, if this is a one-time thing and we think from the phrasing or the imagery on the card that we need this clue or item, maybe we should all just be here and spend the time to do it all together, And so I think that's a cool way that it mixes it up too, so it doesn't get boring. Similarly, in you mentioning the idea of the dice gamifying it. I think it could have also been much more boring if there weren't the dice and it was just always comparing like the number, the stat number on your character card to whatever challenge it is, and you succeed or fail, right? That would be very boring and make the game, in a sense, lean more towards just the story.
Yeah.
Where then I guess something I would want to point out is, even though I've been mentioning a lot about the mechanic of going to a section of a location and reading the story, because I actually really love that mechanic of the game, that isn't to say the game is just about reading stories. Like, there's definitely board games that are more about just the story and choose your own adventure. But there is a sense of a game and exploring and clue gathering and information sharing, which I think is the cool part of it. And so that's why I want to talk about this single mechanic here, which, I mean, even if you guys see this now, I think this is so cool. Like, I don't think I've seen it in other games other than maybe a few cases where they do it out of just looking nice, like making certain cards have artwork that line up, or actually more common, you see like the first version of a game that comes out, and then the expansion box, you can put it next to each other, and then the box cover art is one whole piece of art. Like, that's cool. But this is actually like mechanically in the game, and it has a purpose, right? That it is indicating that you're going to talk to this guy, Bob, of the Time Agency. That's his actual name. I didn't make that up. Or, you're going to here to get into the pod, And so it has that kind of thematic significance. And then on the other side of the card, it also relates to that thematic significance.
Yeah.
Like here, you'll probably have dialogue from Bob that you're reading, but not from over here. Over here is probably you actually getting into the pods and some part of the story like that. And so I think it just looks great, and it's always cool like when you're exploring, because you don't see the different location cards, you just have a deck of cards on the side, like we showed. Whoop.
That's a zoom in of that picture.
Oops, let me stop sharing that. As we showed in this, right, this is actually the whole deck of cards for the scenario, not just a single card. So it's the whole deck. So you don't actually see the locations immediately, but once you choose to move to it, then you'll pull out those A, B, C, D cards and lay them out, and then you'll see the artwork of the location. It's like, oh, this is where we are now. Or even there's sometimes where you'll be surprised of it, because it'll show like, whoa, what's happening here, and then you need to decide, again, plan together, like, okay, I'm gonna go check out this section, you check out that one. And so I think that mechanic is so cool. That's probably my favorite part of the game, I think. I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to mention as a pro? I mean, I think, again, like, even just from looking at the box that I've been showing, or even these scenario boxes, like, this has like a really sleek, white, clean look to it. And then also for each scenario, they have like different artists too. And so the style actually changes. But I think it always looks nice. Like, it's never like badly detailed or colored in some way. It might not be your style or your theme, the theme that you're into, but I think it's always done well. And so, yeah, for like theme wise, I think the game really captures this time travel theme, but then also each scenario's own theme really well, with gorgeous artwork on the cards, the locations, character cards, which you'll see in the spoiler review, or even here, you can even see this example of a location for this asylum one. So yeah, I think the look to it is great. And yeah, I think that's all I would say about the pros.
From a pro standpoint, I think so.
So then going on to the cons, what did not work in Time Stories overall?
So yeah, I would say, and it's more minor gripes to me. The first one, I think it is pretty component heavy as a game. There's a lot of things that you do need to keep track of. So, and I think it is just the nature of how they set it up. So again, it's more of a minor annoyance. It's just trying to keep track of all of the different tokens that are around, because pretty much in every single scenario, you're always using everything in some way, and kind of keeping track. They don't really stack very well. I think that was one of the things that I found with the tokens and stuff. Sometimes you have to have a lot of them, or you need to be moving them around. So they don't really sit or insert very well into places, or like the amount of shields that you have to put on certain challenges. There's a couple times it's like a huge stack of them, and it is a little bit confusing as to like how you're supposed to stack them or what you're supposed to do with them when you're putting them together. So I'd probably say that's like a minor gripe that I have. It's just like sometimes the components feel like it's a little hard to manipulate or hard to kind of use or track over time, right? Because it feels like it tends to get kind of busy with like, how many tokens do I have? How much life do I have? Or like, how many shields are there in the stack that I have to deal with? Or what have you. So
yeah, for me with the tokens, it's the idea that they are generic tokens. And they did try to even make it slightly thematic looking with like the Time Stories logo on it, right, on those. But like these clue tokens are very generic colors and squares and stuff, right? And so like I mentioned, like I think it works as a system that then you can apply scenarios to, but then in that way it's still generic tokens, and that can take you out of the scenario at times. Like I found that more kind of in later scenarios, when I guess the system didn't feel so fresh to me anymore, that then it did take me out of the system, where it's like, okay, I just have this yellow thing, which in this scenario lets me do this once. And it's like, but it's not like it's not a token that's actually in the shape of a bullet. So it looks cooler that I know I actually have like 3 bullets on my character, you know, it's this brown token that I have to remember does a damage, you know, or something like that.
Or as drugs, as we mentioned.
Or drugs, yeah, like this green token is crack. It's like, okay, sure. So yeah, I mean that's my kind of gripe with that. It is this system that works, but it's still limited than being generic tokens. The second con I would want to mention briefly, because I don't think it'll be an issue for that many players, but for some reason for me, and John knows this is always an issue for me with the shield and the combat. I always like have to ask how the combat works.
Every time.
It's not that complicated, right?
Every time. It's hilarious.
Each shield is like a life point of the challenge that you need to get rid of, and you just need a success to get rid of one of them. And if you roll any skulls, you actually take that much damage for however many.
But you only take damage if the challenge has a red skull shield in the challenge.
I think that's the part I always forget.
He always forgets that part.
So it's like
so if it's a challenge that only has like the plain shields on the left, you won't take damage in that challenge. And usually it's thematic to the particular challenge. That's the reasoning why. Versus when there's challenges that have those red skulls on the shields, it's typically representative of the fact that that challenge has threat to your physical life of your receptacle. So then that's why you would take damage in those circumstances. And then the third one being these black tokens, which basically means that if that token remains during the challenge, at the end of the challenge, and you did not get rid of that shield, you automatically lose one of those. So the time looking one is you lose a time unit for not taking that. And then the heart one is you lose a life for not taking care of it. And I don't think we ever played with the one with the actual black shield on it.
Yeah, I don't remember. But and the important thing is also that the challenge itself on the card will indicate which shields are used, but also which order they're stacked up. So that's why you can't necessarily just get rid of all of these red skull ones first, right? You have to go through these first, and then you can start attacking these ones. And so there's a certain order that then can make it difficult.
Yeah, and if you see on the bottom of the board, right, where each of the lettered sections are, there's the 3 kind of sections for the shield tokens, and that's the order, right? I believe you always have to go right to left in terms of eliminating.
Oh, is it right to left or left to right?
or left to right. It's one of the two directions,
Yeah.
left to right or right to left. But it's you have to go through one of those directions to get rid of the shield. So you can't just be like, oh yeah, red, of course, I'm just gonna get rid of those first, right?
Mhm.
You have to work through it depending on the challenge.
But yeah, so that's the part that's always confusing for me. And I have to ask John. But that I don't think that's an issue for most people.
Those real gamers. No. I would say the only other minor, again, another very minor annoyance is when you run out of time and you have to restart. It kind of sucks because you have to reset everything. You have to reset a lot of the deck and stuff. There's certain things that might stay depending on the scenario, but for the most part, you kind of have to reset all the stuff. So it takes a little bit of time to reset things, and especially if it's like your second or third playthrough afterward, or maybe even more subsequently, you do kind of lose a little bit of the allure of the game a bit, and it becomes more about, oh my gosh, can I just get to that particular part that you may have been at? But you do actually have to play through it again, because you have to go through the steps, because there are certain things that you have to do, and it does take time units through the game. So to do that, for the subsequent playthroughs, just remember they are actually separate playthroughs of the game, right? And though that is something you do need to be aware of. And again, it is thematic. It's just annoying for me because I like to just move along through stories, especially if I'm playing through a game that has story. So that to me is a little aggravating, but again, I don't think it's a major negative to the game. It's just more like, expect that to happen if you play this game.
I mean, I do think that can be for people frustrating for people, right? Because they might just be like, we ran out of time. Okay, how about we just undo the last like 5 time unit moves we did? You know, it's like, no, that's not really the spirit of the game, right? And and I think the other part with doing another run and resetting again is there is that memory element to it, right? Where I think that memory element is really cool when it comes to the location cards itself, because it's like I think we've talked about this where the rules might not necessarily say that you're not supposed to read from the cards to each other.
I think it actually does say
Oh, it
in
does
the
say,
game,
okay,
like that the spirit of the game is that you should not read your cards out loud to the other players. I believe it's actually in the rules.
And I think and so I think there's that temptation for people to want to just read off to each other. But I like how, like I mentioned when talking about the whole panorama and location cards thing, that there's also that you get to read that side of the card and then you have to put it back and then communicate. I think that's a cool way of doing a limited communication, or limited communication in a game like this. It's a different way of doing it. But then in that part, bring in memory that can annoy people, I can imagine, where it's like, I just read the card and I put it back and I tell you like the first sentence I read and then I forgot. So I'm going to look at it again and put it back and tell you, and then you might come up with your own rules of like, okay, once you put it back, you can't pick it up again or something like that. But just that memory element I like, but I also can understand that can be a little annoying for people.
Yeah.
But then even more so when you have to reset everything, because then you have to remember the steps you went through, the locations you went through, the clues you found, people you talked to get back to where you were.
Yep.
And if all of you playing together don't remember that, then your runs will repeat a lot of things, and that might be frustrating. So I can definitely see that happening. And I know we've experienced too, at least what you were saying, the whole just the getting tired of having to set things up again.
But I'll be honest, I felt like that really only happened on maybe like the first few scenarios, like maybe the first 3 scenarios we played through, because I think it was also our unfamiliarity with the system and kind of learning what the system is about and how you go about it. I would say actually most of the later scenarios, it was not much of a challenge, or like in that sense of like the issue of that did kind of went away. Right.
I did think in maybe later scenarios there was an issue where if the game is bringing in like a certain mechanic involving certain cards, that we might be uncertain if those should be reset.
Yes.
Like, do I put this away or do we actually still have this available because we know about it already? And there might be some parts, I don't remember specifically, but I just feel like there were some vague parts later on when there were certain mechanics like that.
that one was kind of weird because there are certain symbols that they use that they'll say like, oh, it has a certain like time agency stamp or something on it that says that, oh, if it has this look or this on it, then you get to keep it for the next run. But yeah, there are some other things that come up later in the scenarios and the rules that, especially when it comes to the codex rules, which I think we didn't really talk about, but there are sometimes these codex rules that come into effect or into play based on the scenario that may alter or change rules depending on what's going on. And especially with those ones, that's when it really got a little bit more complicated because those don't have that symbol, but then it's like we know what was happening during that. So what do you do? So, but again, I think it's more just minor things. I don't think it's a really major problem.
And so then I think a final note I would say that's not, I wouldn't say positive or negative, just kind of a neutral note, is that each scenario basically came off like a chance for the game designers or even the designers they had on for those scenarios to try some new mechanic in the game or multiple new mechanics. And so on the one hand, that was cool, where it was like, yeah, like for each scenario, you could expect some slight changes to what you're used to, and it's exciting to figure out how it's going to play out. But then there's also times where it doesn't feel good. Like it's not even necessarily confusing. It just like felt too different from how the game played. And so that's why overall, I would say this is neutral, because this is a non-spoiler review of just kind of the system itself, where then we have ratings, our own ratings for each scenario, each separate scenario, depending on the story and, the mechanics in those. So overall, for at least the system itself, that's kind of just a neutral point to be aware of, that there are scenarios that are better and some that are worse later on,
depending on your likes and dislikes.
And so then with that, we will try to come to the end of this non-spoiler review of Time Stories as a whole, kind of this overview of the game, the series, by giving our rating of the overall series for now. And again, we will have separate ratings for each scenario too. But so for the game overall, and if John wants to guess the weight, you're gonna win a copy of Time Stories. I'm pretty sure the weight on Board Game Geek for this entry, the Time Stories entry, is probably the weight for obviously how the game plays with the Asylum scenario, which is the first scenario that comes in the base game. So John will he'll guess the weight and give his rating.
Yeah. So once again, the rating specific is not to the scenario itself; it's to the overall mechanic. I would give the system overall a 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10.
Because to me, and this might be a slight bias style now though, but I would give it a 9 out of 10 because I love story games in general. I think the development of the cooperative aspects of the requirement of different players doing different things, where it really becomes an experience that every player needs to do something different, where every player, every agent is doing things different, and you have that unique aspect of they have unique information because they're going to particular places that they need to communicate, and you actually have to discuss together that stuff to figure out your actions, to go through the scenarios. I think we've talked about the thematic aspects of the mechanics of the game system fits the world building element of what this game is about, which is you are agents in this time system. So the board is basically your time machines that you're playing through, where it's tracking the time, it's showing you the locations that you're going to as your receptacles. You've got your items that you're kind of managing. You've got the location map of where you need to go. You've got your mission requirements that you need to either you satisfy or you fail. It's got codex kind of rules that will pop up during those scenarios that you have to keep track of. It's like all of those pieces together is that experience of you are in this agency and you are going through this circumstance. So to me, as an experience and as a game to play through, it just hits all of the boxes and it's something that I think that people should play. Like I think if you are a gamer, any kind of a board gamer at all, you should at least go through this experience at least once through. And after you go through it once, you're probably going to want to go through the rest of them. That's my hot take. Even though the game has dice, and dice are kind of a thing for me, but even with the dice. So that's that. And then my weight of the game, I'm going to say 2.67.
What'd you say?
2.67.
2.67.
So I think it's pretty complicated, but I don't think it's the craziest complicated game in the world. But it is a pretty heavy game. It's not a casual game.
Okay, so before we switch over to see if John's right, I will mention my rating. My rating, which will be shown on my Board Game Geek page, meaning I rated it first.
0 out of 10.
Is a 9. You copied me.
You copied me. You copied me. Copy.
I have the proof that'll come on screen after this. I give it a 9. And I think because part of it is, I think, the really early experiences of the game, the first few scenarios that felt so fresh, even going from the first one to the second one of like, oh, they changed the setting this way and then introduced this mechanic. And the mechanics are a cool thing because they aren't just like introducing like trick taking or drafting. I don't mean mechanics that way, but I actually mean more like surprises in the story, but then also how those surprises are discovered. And so it's I'm trying not to spoil things.
Yeah, do not spoil, man. Don't say anything.
But it's just interesting because it's
time.
not mechanics in the strict sense of like, oh, now it becomes, a drafting game, or now it's a pure dice rolling game. No, it's more of how do you go about the story in that given scenario. And the cards, the things they tell you to do could be different. The ways you need to solve the puzzles are different. It's looking at a certain place, or looking at the card a certain way, or finding some specific story clue a certain way, so there's just all these small ways that they kept changing it up, which I thought was really clever. And again, I mentioned there are times where it didn't work well, where it didn't feel that great, but I think majority of times it was cool and clever, the changes from each scenario. And then again, I think the whole idea of being very thematic is important to me. And so it does, as John say, capture that feel of like, yeah, you're these time agents, and this is the overall general reason of why you have this time traveling idea. But I think it captures it well. Not many games have this theme. Very few games have this theme. And of course, this leans to it more of a story element, but that's fine with me. It tells a cool story with each scenario. And then I think it also, in that way, it's kind of in the middle, like the sweet spot between games that feel like they're too much about story. Like I know we played a game called Once Upon a Time, which was more about like you coming up with stories off the top of your head. And so that focused too much on just story, and there's barely any gameplay to it. Where then on the other hand, you have games that feel more like a big sprawling game, and it kind of depends on how much you want to read the flavor text. Games that, the game that I think of like that is like Eldritch Horror and Arkham Horror. Sorry to any fans of those games. Like they look really thematic and they have a whole world built around them. But when I played those, and it's kind of like this, globe trotting, trying to fight the enemies that are these aliens coming in. The cards have so much flavor text.
Aliens.
Huh?
Eldritch Horrors, not aliens.
Eldritch Horrors. The cards have so much flavor text, but if you don't read them, you're just kind of moving around on a map, rolling dice to defeat things. But then if you read them, then that really just depends on how much you're into reading those kind of Eldritch Horror kind of things that are happening in the world. Where in this game, it kind of comes into the sweet spot where like it pulls you into the story because you need to know what's happening in the story to then also go on, figure out where you need to go, who you need to find, and so on. So it does a really good way of making the story important, but then also not making it just a story game that has other mechanics that you're also playing through. So a 9. That's my long way of saying 9. And so to verify this now, we will go to Board Game Geek. Ooh. John, you still there? So this is the my Board Game Geek page for time.
Hello.
Hello.
Are we still recording? End of the
Says
cycle.
that it is.
End of the video.
I hope it is.
We have a really awkward pause that just happened right there.
Yeah, technical difficulties. Probably my internet. Hopefully this did record everything we just said. We will check it out right after this. But quickly to go to the Board Game Geek page.
I said 2.65.
I thought you said 2.67.
So close. No.
But yes, not close enough. I mean, why would you want to copy this game? You already played through it.
Doesn't matter. I was so close to getting a free game.
And so, like I mentioned, a 9 from me, 9 from John. And so actually this for me puts it, I think, in maybe my top 10. Maybe, I mean, this was a rating I probably gave a few years ago, but it could still be in my top 10 because of that.
Yeah.
Average rating 7.6, which I think I know why it might be 7.6. Partly might be the weight and how hard it is for people to get into it, but I also think it might be people's opinions after they finish the whole series. Some people may not like how the overall story ended. Mm-hmm. So just letting you know, that might be why too. But yeah, so John was close, doesn't get a copy of the game, but we both gave it a 9. And so, yeah, with that, like we mentioned at the beginning too, we are going to record a second video, a spoiler video of the first scenario. And so hopefully if you guys found this interesting and are okay with it being spoiled for you, you can check out that video after this one. It'll go up sometime after this one, soon after, hopefully. But yeah, with that, that's our review of Time Stories overall. If you found this helpful, interesting, we would definitely say it's a game worth checking out. I also do agree with John that it is really one of those games to experience, kind of like with the mind, except even deeper experience. I think it's something people should experience. And so with that, if you found this helpful, I hope you'll share this with family, friends, those you want to play board games with. Hope you get to try the game. And with that, until next time, we'll see you then.
Actually, sorry, I was going to say, one other potential con to this game. It's it's more of a, again, I don't know if it's a con per se, but as we mentioned, there's a lot of scenarios, there's a lot of things going on with this game, so it is a price point. So just be aware, if you really want to experience it, like all of the scenarios to the game, there's a lot, because you have to buy every expansion separately. So I did want to mention that too.
That's true. The
slight con
game is probably like, I want to say retails 50, maybe
for the
60.
base, and then each of the expansions is like what, 35, I think.
Yeah, 30, 35.
30 to 35. So it can be pricey to get every single scenario over time. So I did want to mention that too, just as a small price thing. So, but that's just when you get the other friends who are experiencing it with you to buy the
then you can pitch in.
Exactly.
Right, John? You can pitch in?
I haven't done, because Ben's already bought it, so it's fine.
But yes, thanks for watching. Until next time, we'll see you then. Bye.